Welcome to Live DAF, your online DAF Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's DAF Yomi KESUVOS Yudalid. We're holding on the very last line of Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Hahu Orus Varus Sasei. There was a fellow who was engaged to an Isha. So the Orus, the man, and the Isha, the Arusa, they approached Rav Yosef. The Asul Kamed, Rav Yosef, they come to Rav Yosef. You have a problem. Turns out she is expecting. And how do we treat this child? He Amra Minei. She claims that the Orus fathered the child, in which case he's kosher. V'hu Amar, and the fellow responds, yes, certainly, correct. Minai, I am the father. So he acknowledges her claim. Amar Rav Yosef, what's the concern in this case? Everything's fine. Chada, number one, the father is in full acknowledgement. There's no conflict in terms of what happened. V'oid, in addition, even without his hoidah, the child would be safe and kosher. V'oid ha'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha k'Rabbi Gamliel. We had a discussion yesterday with an Isha who had a questionable interaction with an unknown fellow. Who is he? She says, well, he's a kosher. His involvement with myself would not disable me from marrying a kohen. Rabbi Gamliel says, menas. We maintain her cheskas kashrus and we believe her words. Therefore, over here as well, says Rav Yosef. Look, number one, the husband acknowledges that he was involved. Number two, even without that, we follow Rabbi Gamliel. Halacha Rabbi Gamliel, and she is Neman. Amali Abaye. Abaye asked him like this. But in this case, if the Aris would not acknowledge, Machshir Rabbi Gamliel, can you say that we follow Rabbi Gamliel's Shita and we are Machshir the Isha, Machshir the child? You can't do that. V'amar le Shmuel Rav Yehuda. Rav Shmuel turns to Rav Yehuda Shin, I called him the sharp one. You should know, true. Of course, halacha k'Rabbi Gamliel. In theory, we paskin like Rabbi Gamliel when the Isha has a claim and is supported by her pristine track record, her cheskas kashrus. She is ne'emenes, she is believed. But we have to be machmer. Va'at, you, loy tavid uvda. Don't actually carry it out, lamasa. Don't implement it. Ad adika roiv ksher etzel, unless you have a roiv factor on top of that. Meaning that she was exposed to more candidates, so to speak, that are a kosher. So there are more potential partners that would not affect her adversely. So when you have that roiv factor playing in her favor, that supports her taina, supports her claim that she's kosher and she's neman. But in our case, there's more potential for trouble than otherwise. Look, the only fellow who's allowed to interact with her minator is the Aris. Everybody else is apostle, because remember, she's like married. Right? In the olden days, they would get engaged and marry only about a year later. Between that engagement and marriage period, there would be a din of Eshes Ish on this Isha. Right? So there are more candidates, more likelihood of psul than kosher. So how can you, Rav Yosef, maintain that, well, over here she's neman like Rabbi Gamliel? Lamaisa, we don't paskin like Rabbi Gamliel unless we have a roiv factor in her favor, which in this case does not exist. Rav Yosef responds, well, according to you, tikshilachi gufa. How do you explain Shmuel's statement? It's inherently contradictory. He begins halacha, right? We follow Rabbi Gamliel, and then follows by saying va'at le'savid uvda. Well, don't follow through. Which way is it? Oh, apparently you have to say there are two levels. When an Isha had a questionable interaction with a questionable, unidentified fellow, the question is whether that interaction affected her status vis-a-vis marrying a kohen. L'chadchila, you can't believe her. But b'diavad, okay, once she married, we don't separate them. So l'chadchila, unless she has a roiv factor playing in her favor, you can't go with her claim. But if it's after the fact, leave it alone. In our case, is the classic b'di'evet. There's a child coming to the world. There's Aris Varusa, they're engaged to be married. It's after the fact. So if you don't believe her, you're going to separate her from the husband, you're going to make the child puzzle. You don't get a greater b'di'evet than this. In this case, of course, you have to go with her claim. And that explains Rav Yosef, who said, look, there are two reasons for kashrus. Number one, he's acknowledging. Number two, she's claiming. And we trust her, especially when it's a b'di'evet. Ramali Abai l'Rava, Rabbi asks a kasha of Rava. Samagaris Rabbi. So we know about this great machlokes between Ram Gamliel, who says we believe the Isha when there's a questionable interaction and a shaila regarding her status. And we have Rabbi Yeshua, who says, no, we can't believe her, despite the fact that she has a cheskos kashrus. Right? We had all sugi yesterday. Well, machmer when it comes to yichus. Okay. Umi Amar Rabbi Yeshua in a menace. Is that so? That according to Rabbi Yeshua, you can't believe the Isha? Vera aminu, we're going to have a kasha. Hey, the Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi David Beseira, they both testified. Al almanas Isa. An almana who has a suffix regarding her status. Sheik sherer lekahuna. She's kosher to marry a kohen. Isa, like a dough which has many ingredients. There are many uncertainties factored into her story. So what happened was, Reuven was married to Rachel. Rashi says he threw her a get, tossed her a get, and we're not sure where it landed, closer to him or to her. And if it landed closer to her, the get becomes activated. So we're not sure what happened. Suffix Gershon, and then Reuven passes away. So this Isha, Rachel, can either be a Gerusha, unable to marry a kohen, or an almana who can marry an ordinary kohen, a kohen hedyot. She goes and marries a kohen. If she was a Gerusha, now she becomes a chalala. She becomes adversely affected by that interaction with the kohen. Now she has a son who's a suffix, chalal. And now an Isha, call her Leah, marries this son who is a suffix chalal. What happens to her upon his passing? Is she a chalala as well, affected by the chalal? It's contagious. It's just it spreads. It extends over to the wife as well. Or maybe he was okay because his wife was never a grusha, etc., etc. On almanas Isa, the almana of this son here, we have a suffix as per her status regarding marrying a kohen. Rabbi Yeshua testified she's okay. Sheik sherer lekahuna. Apparently, because she has a cheskas kashrus, she was kosher all along, so we assume that she remained kosher, unaffected by this fellow. We assume this fellow was fine as well. Right? So Rabbi Shua works with cheskas kashrus. 1 second. Rabbi Shua, in the previous Mishnah, contends that when we have a suffix regarding her status, we have to be machmer. Amar lei, so Rabbi responds, you can't compare. Here it's marriage, and over there it wasn't. Hachi hashta, how do you compare the two things? Hasam. In the case of the almanas Isa, Isha Nisis. We're speaking about a woman who's marrying. Before you marry, you look into your prospective match. Boidekas v'nisis. We assume she investigated the matter and concluded that in fact there was no issue of chalal. She determined that the mother was never divorced, etc. So we could just assume that she's kosher. Hacha, as opposed to the previous Mishnah, where there was an improper interaction with a man, Isha Mazana was a case of inappropriate behavior. But is that Mazana? Since when does the Isha investigate, and since when is she too particular with whom she's mezana with? And therefore there's a straight out suffix, and we make her puzzle out of uncertainty. Amar Rava, 1 second. I understand You had a kasha between Rabbi Shua by us, who says she's possible, and Rabbi Shua by the Almanas Isa, who contends that she's kosher, and you answered. But let's not forget that there's another kasha as well. The Rabbi Shua kasha. You had a kasha between two Rabbi Shuas, the Rabbi Gamliel, the Rabbi Gamliel like kasha. What about the stira between two Rabbi Gamliels? Why was that not a kasha to you? What does he mean? Vaktani Sefa. Take a look at the end of that brisa regarding the Almanas Isa. Amal and Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel got involved, responding to those two Tanaim who considered her to be kosher. And he says, look, Kibalnu Duschem. We trust your testimony. I understand that you had a Kabbalah that she's kosher. But what can we do? We can't implement this. Avalman Nase. What are we going to do about it? Shari Gazar, Rabbi Yochanan Zakai. Rabbi Yochanan decreed not to have Bedin set up shop for this, not to implement this. Shakahanim, Shemin Lachem, because the Kehanim are very conscientious and possessive about their yichus, they're not going to listen to you. They'll only listen to Larachik to consider her to be puzzle and prevent her from integrating with them. Avaloi Lekarev, they will not accept that she is kosher and allow it to integrate. And basically, Rabbi Gamliel was quoting this approach, and it sounds like he agreed with it, that she's considered problematic. She's puzzle. What do you mean? Yesterday, Rabbi Gamliel tells us, when there's a suffix as per the Isha's status, cheskas kashrus. She's considered kosher. And she can marry a kohen. So you have a double steer. It's not just Rabbi Yeshua with Rabbi Yeshua, it's Rabbi Gamliel versus Rabbi Gamliel. And therefore Rabbi will now reframe the entire case, in which case we'll see clearly that it's unrelated to yesterday's case. Elam Rava was speaking about an entirely different set of circumstances. The Rabbi Gamliel, the Rabbi Gamliel like Kash, there's no steer between the Rabbi Gamliels. Hassam Bari, in the previous Mishnah, she's claiming, I know what's going on. This is the fellow I was involved with, and he was a kosher. Hashem, I hear. She has no clue. She has no idea what happened to the grandmother with the get. And therefore, we have to question her status. At the same time, let's take a look at Rabbi Yeshua. The Rabbi Yeshua, Namalei Kasha. That too will not be a difficult a steerer. We're speaking about two different circumstances. Hasam Chatzveka. In the previous Mishnah, it was just one suffix. Who was that fellow that you interacted with? Well, when it's one suffix, you have to be strict about it. Suffix Isra L'chumra. Hachatrei Sveki. But over here by the Almanas Isa, you're dealing with a double-decker suffix. Why? We have three pshatim. Pshat 1 in Rashi is, there are two women involved here. There's Rachel, Reuven's former wife. There's a suffix as per her status. Was she a grusha and did she marry a kohen, which invalidates her from marrying a kohen further? That's one shaila. There's one cheskas kashrus there pointing in her direction, pointing to her benefit. And then we have the Almanas Isa, the one who married this woman's Rachel's son. Next question. When I married the son, was I adversely affected? Because is this son a chalul or not? So I also have a cheskas kashrus for myself. So it's a double cheskas kashrus. There are two reasons to go lekula. That's one pshat in Rashi. Next pshat in Rashi is that the entire story started with a svek. Reuven was married to Rachel. Tossed her some questionable get, right? And then she married Shimon, and they had a child partway into Shimon's marriage, 7 months into the marriage. We're not sure who fathered the child. Is he Shimon's child, which makes him a chalal, because Shimon married Rachel after having been divorced from Reuven. Shimon, a kohen, cannot do that. So if the son is Shimon's son, he's a chalal, but perhaps he's really Reuven's son, in which case it's a non-issue for him. He preempted the entire story. He's Reuven's son, perfectly legitimate. So the entire story starts with a double suffix. We're not even sure if she's a grusha, and either way, we don't know whose child this is. In which case, it could be totally kosher if he's Reuven's child. So it's a double suffix. Taisus learns that we're speaking that there was a Safek Chol mixed into a family. We don't even know who he is. So bottom line is, it's not a straightforward Safek. And that presents a mitigating factor. All the more reason to make it kosher, hilkach. Therefore, let's conclude like this. Once we've established that this last story of Almanas Isa presents an entirely different set of circumstances than the previous mission of the Isha interacting with a man directly, that allows us to understand the difference between the two cases, and subsequently explain why, according to Rabbi Shua, in the previous case it's Aser, and over here it's Mutter, and likewise, according to Rabbi Gamliel, the other way around, why in the previous case it's Mutter, and over here it's Aser. Hilkach, therefore, the Rabbi Gamliel, Olam le Bari. According to Rabbi Gamliel, the Bari, the certain claim of the Isha of yesterday, who says, I know this is the man I interacted with, that's a strong factor. Therefore, even if we're dealing with one single suffix, it's still okay, because she's saying Bari. Vikil le Shema, in contrast to the most recent case, where it's just a Shema that can't not be taken too seriously. She doesn't have an absolute claim in our case. She has no idea what happened to the mother with the get. And therefore, we have to treat it more strictly. Therefore, even though it's a double suffix, we're focusing on the person's claim. When you have a vade claim, okay, but if it's a shema, we can't do much about it. That's Rabbi Gamliel. And that's why yesterday he says kasher, today he says puzzle. It's all a matter of that personal dimension. What are you claiming? Bari, you're okay. Shema, that's a problem. As opposed to Rabbi Yeshua, who takes a more direct approach and looks at just at the circumstances. The Rabbi Yeshua, Olam lechat sveka, according to him, yesterday's case where it's one suffix. One suffix is pretty serious. That's a paramount factor. And therefore, even if she's claiming with certainty, Ish plainly v'kasheru, I know who this man is, it's possible. V'kilei svek sveka, as opposed to our case where it's a double suffix. So that presents a mitigating factor. And therefore, even if she's not sure about what happened, she doesn't have a claim. She has no idea. We disregard that, and the fact that it's a svek, that in itself is reason enough to make it okay. So bottom line is, we started with the case of the Oris Varusa. We have a child in question. She says, look, it's fathered by the Oris, and he acknowledges it. Rabbi says, look, we have two reasons why it's fine. Her claim, his claim. And the Gemara concludes that although typically we try to be machmir, we need a roiv, and over here don't have a roiv ksherim. Because most people out there are puzzled to this isha, except for the Oris. Still, it's a b'di'ev, and therefore we follow Rabbi Gamliel. Bari is Neman, especially here where he's acknowledging and he's being made. We proceeded with a stira. We have the story of the Almanas Isa, where there was a whole story with a get and a Savik Chalal. Rabbi Shua says it's okay. Rabbi Gamliel says it's not okay. And that's exactly the opposite of their opinions yesterday. When Isha interacted with a man of questionable origin. Question, who was this man? She says he's fine. Rabbi Gamliel says Na'amenes, and she remains kasha lakuna. Rabbi Shua says no, she's not believed, she's pasal lakuna. What's the difference? The way Rabbi tells it to us, Rabbi Gamliel focuses on the claim of the person involved, the personal aspect of the story. In case number one, it's Bari, she's believed. We heard Shema, there's nothing to believe. Rabbi Yeshua focuses on the actual circumstances. There, it's one suffix, it's a problem. Here, it's a svek, so it's okay. Taner Rabbanon. Let's move on with the Almanas Isa, which according to the Edus of Rabbi Yeshua, she's okay. Ezu Almanas Isa, kol she'ein ba lo mishmam zerus, provided there is no element of mamzer to discuss. Meaning, it's a question of whether he's a chalal, but if there's any mamzer question here, that's a problem. And soon the Gemara will explain what the difference is. Lo mishum mamzerus, lo mishum nasinos, or there's no question of a nasin getting mixed in. Nasin is that nation which could not marry into the community. We're not concerned about an Evet. Rashi says we pick Avdi Malachim because that's typically what happened. The Avdi Shleimai would marry into Klal Yisrael. So there's no concern of Mamzeris, Nesinus, and Avdis. Only a question of a Chalal, as we explained, based on the get, etc. Amar Rabbi Meir, Shamati, Kol She'ein Ba'echad Mikol Elu Masin L'Kula. I heard that in fact, if there is no other factor, other than the question of the Chalal, there's nothing regarding Mamzer, etc., then she's free to marry a Kohen. So Rabbi is pretty much mirroring and just duplicating the Tanakama's Shita, which is going to be a kasha, which the Gemara will ask. So the first kasha will be, what's the difference between these types of deficiencies, which are Minat Torah, and the Chalal, which is also Minat Torah? Number two, what's Rabbi Meir adding? Next Tana, Reb Shimon Lazar Oima Mishum Rabbi Meir, his version of Rabbi Meir was as follows. V'chein, and likewise, Reb Shimon Menasya Omer Kidvar. He also backed up this shita, which will sound almost like, again, a duplication. Zohi Almanas Isa. When do we say Almanas Isa is kasha l'kuhuna? Again, Kol Shenitma Ba Safik Chalal, if she got involved with a Safik Chalal. So it sounds like he's okay with the halacha. A Safik Chalal will not create too big of a problem. But then, he seems to conclude by saying just the opposite, taking a totally 360. Makirun Yisrael Mamzer Shabeneim. Klal Yisrael generally are inclined to identifying Mamzer amongst them. And therefore, when a fellow is a Safek Mamzer, don't worry that he's really a Mamzer. He would have been identified and it would have been known to all. But a Chalal, you never know. Ve'in Makirin, Chalal and Shabeneim, not necessarily do we identify the Chalalim, and this fellow who's a Safek Chalal, you never know, he might really be a Chalal, and it's unknown to the public. Now it sounds like he's expressing concern about getting involved with a Safek Chalal who might in fact turn out to be a real Chalal. And a minute ago he just said that a Safek Chalal is okay. It seems to be an inherent contradiction within his shita. So we have a total of 3 kashas. Amar, let's go back to the Brisa. Aizel Almanas Isa. What's the Almanas Isa who can marry a Kohen? Kol she'ein balei misham amzerus, v'lei misham sinus, v'lei misham avdei malachim. There's no concern other than a chalal, right? Ha chalal kasher. If there's a Safek Chalal, you're okay. What's the difference? The issue of a chalal marrying a Kohen is just as severe as a mamzer marrying a Yisrael. Ma'ish nahanach da'raisa. Why? What's wrong with the mamzer and etc.? Because there is a da'raisa. Well, chalal nami da'raisa. Chalal concern presents just as much of a concern. It's Issa Deraisa. So what's the difference? That's kasha number 1. Kasha number 2 is Visu. Rabbi Meir seems to duplicate the Tanakama. Shamati, I heard, Kol she'ein ba echad mikol elu masin l'kuna. If you're free of any other concerns, meaning mamzer and nasan, then the only concern is Safek Chalal. Go ahead and marry a Kohen. Hainu Tanakama. It's exactly what the Tanakama just told us. What's the point of repeating the same sheet? Visu, here comes the third kasha. Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar Aimer, Mishum Rabbi Meir. So his version of Rabbi Meir is slightly different. V'chein haya, likewise, Rabbi Shimon ben Asya Aimer Kedvar, he also supported the same shita, which is, and he starts off by saying that Almanas Isa is okay, and then he sort of takes a turn and indicates otherwise. Zoy Almanas Isa, which is considered kosher, Kol shenitma ba Safek Chalal. As we explained, it's okay. And then he continues with a note of concern. We have to be concerned about a Safek Chalal. A Safek Mamzer, don't worry, we all know about the Mamzer. Makir and Yisrael, Mamzer and Shebenein. Klal Yisrael has the Mamzerim tag. Don't worry about the Safek Mamzer. It's most likely not a real Mamzer. Otherwise, he would have been known to the public. But when it comes to a Safek Chalal, you never know. It's not such a known thing, and we have to be concerned that perhaps he's really a Chalal. Ve'ein makir and Chalal shebenein. Klal Yisrael, the community, doesn't necessarily know and identify and isn't necessarily aware of the Chalalim amongst them, and therefore, when it's a Safek Chalal, that presents a real concern of perhaps him really being a Chalal. What's going on? But Amris Reishi just told me a minute ago, Chalal Kasha, when it's an Almana of a Isa, of a Chalal, it's fine. So you have 3 kashas. Rabbi Yechanan. Let me give you the the new perspective on this price. We're dealing with two separate sets of circumstance. Meaning, we have the classic case, almanas isa, right? So there was a question of a get and a child and an almana of that child, who perhaps is married to a chalal. Now she cannot marry a kohen. That's the almanas isa that we discussed, which was inherently a suffix, was an unknown sort of situation. In that case, certainly it's fine. That's not up for discussion here. So what then are we speaking about? Tanakama, Rab Meir, etc. What are they talking about? We're speaking about a very specific, unique case, which is that a fellow was confronted. He was accused of being a pasuk, a mamzer, a chalal, and he remained silent, which perhaps is an indication of acknowledgement. We all know about shtika kahida, right? Remaining silent in face of accusations sometimes is indicative of consent, of acknowledgement, of agreement. And that's the topic of conversation here. Amar B'Yichnan, Mamzer Tzveich, was speaking about a fellow who, when accused of being a mamzer, he responds by denying it, vehemently denying. What are you talking about? I'm a mamzer. He's yelling and screaming. How dare you accuse me? V'chol shaisik. But then, when somebody calls him a chalal, you don't hear nothing. You don't hear anything from him. Ikibinau. That's the case that we're speaking about. So when he's called mamzer, suddenly he jumps up to life and his vocal cords are pretty active. But when he's accused of being a chalal, he remains silent, which perhaps, it raises concerns. Look, on the one hand, you're all insulted, and then you suddenly remain silent. Perhaps that's a raya that you're acknowledging that in fact you're a chalal. That's the question at hand. That will be the nafkamina between the shitas. Tanakama savar kol pasal the karle v'shasik. Pasal. Tanakama holds all across the board. If a fellow was called a pasal, right? He was accused of being a mamzer or a chalal or anything. Called pasal the karli, any psul that was hurled in his direction, v'shasik, and he still remained silent. Shtika kaida, you have to be chayshish that it's an acknowledgement, and he's considered pasal. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Tanakama shita is shtika kaida. V'achikamer Tanakama. That's exactly what the Tanakama meant when he started by saying aizel almanas isa. When do we say the almana can remarry, can go marry a kohen? Kol she'en bo lo yishtuk mamzerus, lo yishtuk nezinus, lo yishtuk avdei Menachem, lo yishtuk chalal. That is only provided that there is no shtika element introduced into the story. Rather, she was married to this fellow who was known to be a suffix, based on that whole story, that whole history. It wasn't like somebody accused him and he acknowledged. No, that's the almanas isa. Provided there is no element of shtuk mamzerus, which basically means somebody accused her husband of being a mamzer and he remained silent. Or shtuk nesinus, accused him of being a nasan. Or shtuk avdei Menachem, or shtuk chalal. Because in either one of those cases, his shtika can be interpreted as an acknowledgement, which makes him absolutely pasal. So in that case, we don't have the heter of almanas isa. We have to treat it as a vade pasal. That's Tanakama. Rabbi responds to the Tanakama by saying, look, in concept, in theory, yeah, shtika can pose a concern, but it depends when. Sometimes yes, and sometimes not. Hanachu, it depends how serious an accusation it is. It depends how insulting it is, which should prompt a denial. Then you have a concern. But otherwise, leave it alone. Hanachu. Only those examples that you cited, mamzer, nasan, evet, that's pretty serious. The kapasale bekal, which makes him puzzle, doesn't allow him to marry into the community. That's a serious insult. He should have responded. His silence is interpreted as implicit consent. Avol shtuk chalal kasha. But let's say he's accused of being a chalal. He remains silent. Big deal. That doesn't mean anything. That's not such a severe insult. A chalal doesn't marry a kohen. Okay, fine. I can handle that. The reason for his silence is because he ignores it. He doesn't care. So that's not a right. So Rabbi Meir contends that in concept shtika, word interpreted as an acknowledgement, sure, that poses a concern and confirms his psul. But in the case where it's just a semi-insult which he could swallow, his lack of response is not indicative of any confirmation. So it all depends on the severity of the insult. That's Rabbi Meir's approach. And the third sheet of the Brisa will flip it around, totally the opposite. So Reb Shimon responds to the first version of Reb Meir, the Tana who quoted Reb Meir until now, Tanakam de Reb Meir. He says, look, I want to flip things around. Sometimes shtika poses a concern, sometimes not, but just the opposite of the way you presented it. It's all a question of how to interpret this fellow's mindset. If indeed you have heard that Reb Meir sometimes is not concerned when there's shtika, does not interpret silence as acknowledgement, so silence does not pose concern. If that is the case, loy dekar lechalal v'shasik. It's not speaking where he was called a chalal and remained silent. I maintain that in that case there is more reason for concern. We'll see in a minute why. Ella, rather, when is silence not interpreted as a confirmation? When does silence not pose concern? Ella dekar le mamzer v'shasik, when he was called a mamzer and he remained silent. Because then he says, look, leave me alone. V'ayde shasik. The reason for his silence is savar, because he figures, what are you talking about? Mamzer kala isli. Everybody knows about a mamzer. And everybody knows I'm not a mamzer. I don't have to reckon with your accusations. So remaining silent in the face of being accused of a mamzer doesn't mean anything. You're totally out of mark. You're totally out to lunch. Aval mamzer v'tzavach. But in a case where he was accused of being a shtuki, and there he remained silent, that in fact will pose a concern. So aval mamzer v'tzavach. But if he was accused of mamzer and he denies, he's tzavach, he yells out, what are you talking about? Denies the accusation. So we see that this fellow jumps to life when accused. And at the same time, a minute later, he's called a chalal v'shoisek and remains silent. Puzzle. That presents a concern. That confirms his psul. Why? You see, if you're accusing him of being a mamzer, I disregard your accusation. Everybody knows I'm not a mamzer. If I would be a mamzer, everybody would know about it. So I just disregard, I ignore what you say. But in a case where I'm being accused of being a chalal, that's not necessarily so widely known. So in this case, the fact that I'm silent raises concerns. That the reason why he was silent, suffers because he's thinking mistaye. Delay mapkile mikol. Mistaye means enough. I'm hoping that I will not lose my call privileges. Basically what he's saying is like this. Let's keep it on the wraps. I'd rather not make a scene, not make a ruckus here. I won't respond to my accusers. Because if I respond, yeah, chal, no chal, yeah, everybody's going to get into it. Look, the argument going on in shul, they're going to look into it and perhaps it will be known that I'm a chalal. Better keep it quiet. Just ignore him. Plug my ears and turn around, ignore him. Don't make a scene. And hopefully, this will help me from becoming puzzled. So the fact that I am shoisik in the face of a chalal accusation gives credibility, lends a concern to the possibility that he is a chalal. And this, of course, is combined with the fact that a minute ago I was yelling when accused of being a mamzer. So you see that I'm a person that takes offense. So here I'm yelling, and here I'm remaining silent. That's a riot that perhaps there's a concern, and we have to treat him as a puzzle. So bottom line is, we have 3 shittas regarding shtika, a fellow who is accused, who was labeled as a puzzle. Tanakama says, silence equals psul. Rabbi in the first version says, only if it's a serious accusation. In the second version of Rabbi, it's only when it's something which is not widely known, in which case we're concerned that he's trying to hide it. Now, Tani Chada, we have one brisa. Rabbi Yisrael Eimer shtuk mamzer kosher, shtuk cholol puzzle. That if he's a shtuk when it comes to a mamzer accusation, that's okay. But when it comes to cholol, he's puzzle. This sounds like the most recent version of Rabbi, right? With Tani Idach, we have the other brisa, just the opposite. Shtuk cholol kosher. By cholol, it's okay. Shtuk mamzer puzzle. By mamzer, where it's a more serious accusation, if you remain silent, it's puzzle. That's like the first version of Rameir. Like Kasha, the answer is, depends who's speaking. Tanakama. I'll leave it to Rameir. The most recent brisa is consistent with the first version of Rameir. All depends on the severity of the insult. Whereas the first brisa here is following Shita, Rav Shimon Lazar, I'll leave it to Rameir, who says just the opposite. So bottom line is like this. We have 2 distinct cases here. We have the Almanas Isa, where an Isha marries a fellow of questionable origin. He hails from a mother who had a Safek Gershon and went on to marry a Kain, entirely suffix Feka related. Not really possible to figure out at this moment. So what happens to this Almana, who really has a Cheskes Kashrus, going for her? Rabbi Shua says, look, the suffix Feka, the double suffix, leave it alone. On the other hand, Rabbi Mendel says, look, here it's actually worse than the cases we discussed yesterday, because over here, she doesn't even have a valid claim. She doesn't have a bari. She doesn't know what's going on. It's a shema. So even though it's one suffix, we consider her to be puzzle. Now we moved on to the next price, which seems to be working with Shitas Rabbi Shua. The Almanas Isa's kasha, but when there's another factor involved called shtika, that's a whole new discussion. Tanakama says any shtika is deemed an acknowledgement of the accusation, in which case she's puzzle. Rabbi in the first version looks at the severity of the accusation. Mamzer, that's really serious. A serious insult, you should have responded. Lack of response denotes acknowledgement. But if it's merely just a cholol accusation, I don't have to respond to that. According to Rabbi in version number 2, it's the other way around. If I'm accused of being a mamzer, disregard that. Everybody knows I'm not a mamzer. But if he's accused of being a cholol, and as the Gemara explains, we see this fellow is vehement about his protecting his honor. When he's accused of being a mamzer, he yells out, and suddenly now he's silent. That leads us to believe that he's trying to hide something, and in which case we consider him as a puzzle. Okay, let's just briefly recap the Amud Aleph as well. We had a story of the Oris Varusa, who are having a child, and they both are moida that it's from them. The conclusion was that it's fine. He acknowledges, she has a claim, we're speaking b'di'evid, it's okay. Then we seem to have a double stira, because we introduced the story of the Almanas Isa, where the Almana now is a suffix, whether she's kasha l'kahuna. Rabbi Shua says she's fine. Rabbi Mendel says she's not, which is the exact opposite of their shittas yesterday. We asked the Isha, who is that fellow that you interacted with? Did he make you puzzle a kahuna? She says, no, this fellow is an upstanding fellow. Rabbi Mendel says she's okay. Rabbi Yeshua says she's not, which is exactly the opposite of their shittas today. And Rabbi's conclusion was, look, we're speaking about entirely different set of events, different set of circumstances, and therefore there's no connection. In the case of the Almanas Isa, we have a sveka, so that's a factor in her favor. On the other hand, she's not claiming bari, she doesn't know what happened, so that's a factor against her. So that explains the discrepancy with the shittas. According to Rabbi Shua, we look at the actual circumstance. In the case yesterday, it was only one suffix, it's a problem. Today we have a sveka that helps her out. Rabbi Gamliel focuses on the personal dimension of things. Yesterday, she had a bari. She has a definite claim. Then we trust her, and we combine it with the cheskes kashrus that she's okay today. She himself doesn't know what happened, so it's at most a shema, in which case we can't consider her kasher. And we concluded with the Gemara Amud Beis, a brisa which contains three shittas regarding a fellow who maintained his silence in the face of accusations. All the best to you, and much hatzlach.